For millennia, humanity has been captivated by the siren song of conflict. From the earliest communal gatherings to the vast geopolitical landscapes of today, strife has rarely been absent from the human experience. Our tools of engagement have evolved dramatically, transitioning from rudimentary swords and shields to the devastating power of modern artillery, tanks, and drones that strike from continents away. Yet, while the instruments of war change, the underlying currents that draw us into battle appear to remain stubbornly constant. This raises a profound question: what inherent forces perpetually steer us towards confrontation, and can a lasting peace ever truly be achieved? To unravel this enduring paradox, we must delve into the multifaceted origins of global conflict, exploring the historical, economic, ideological, and even psychological factors that render perpetual war a grim reality. The historical record bears stark testimony to humanity's inclination towards conflict. For ancient empires, war was not merely an option, but an existential reality, an integral mechanism for survival and expansion. The Roman Empire, for instance, did not extend its dominion through diplomatic overtures, but through centuries of relentless and systematic military conquest. The vast Mongol Empire, at its zenith, commanded an astonishing 16% of Earth's landmass and a quarter of its population, all acquired through unparalleled military campaigns. Similarly, figures such as Alexander the Great dedicated virtually their entire adult lives to warfare, forging an empire that stretched from the Hellenic world to the Indian subcontinent. Even in what is often considered the more enlightened modern era, this cycle of conflict has persisted. Astonishingly, over the past 3,400 years, humanity has recorded only approximately 268 years without war, representing less than 8% of recorded history. Despite countless efforts to secure peace, including the signing of over 8,000 treaties before 1932 alone, the 20th century, often celebrated for its strides in international law, ironically became the bloodiest chapter in human history. 2 world wars alone claimed over 100 million lives, and the ensuing Cold War fueled dozens of proxy conflicts, trapping entire regions in spirals of violence. The Middle East, for instance, has been in a state of near-continuous warfare since the 1940s, while Africa experienced over 80 coups between 1960 and 2000, with another dozen in just the past 2 decades. Although major global powers have largely avoided direct confrontation since World War II, primarily due to the chilling deterrence of nuclear weapons, this has not prevented conflict elsewhere, with over 150 armed wars erupting from Korea and Vietnam to Afghanistan, Iraq, and most recently, Ukraine. Throughout history, peace has consistently been the exception, not the rule. Despite the evolution of warfare itself, its root causes have remained remarkably consistent. Foremost among these is the relentless competition for resources. Nations have historically resorted to war when they perceive their survival or prosperity to be dependent on acquiring resources held by others. This fundamental driver has only intensified as the global population has surged from a mere 1 billion in 1800 to over 8 billion today, multiplying the number of people vying for finite resources eightfold. Water, the most fundamental human necessity, exemplifies this burgeoning pressure. The Organization for Economic Counter-Operation and Development projects a 55% increase in global water demand by 2050, precisely as climate change pushes existing supplies to their breaking point. This scarcity already fuels disputes worldwide, such as clashes between India and Pakistan over the Indus River, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq contesting the Euphrates-Tigris basin, and Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt debating the Nile. Even in developed nations, like the United States, multiple states are locked in contention over the dwindling Colorado River. While some contemporary disputes may be resolved peacefully, history suggests that vital rivers often served as natural borders and strategic assets, triggering countless conflicts. Energy resources represent another potent catalyst for global instability. The entire energy supply chain, extraction, refining, transport, and consumption, is rife with potential for disputes, territorial claims, and outright war. For example, while the conflict in Ukraine in 2022 was outwardly framed around political tensions and NATO expansion, significant underlying motives included Ukraine's vast reserves of natural gas and other critical minerals. Europe's continued reliance on Russian energy, even years into the conflict, underscores this reality. Some European nations have spent more on Russian fuel than on aid and weapons for Ukraine. This is merely one prominent instance of the ongoing struggle for natural resources. China's assertive claims in the South China Sea, for instance, are less about defensive posturing against Western powers and more about securing control over rich undersea oil and gas deposits, the extraction of which is hampered by unresolved sovereignty disputes. Accusations of illegal drilling in contested waters further highlight this resource imperative. Even with substantial energy imports and discounted Russian oil fueling its economy, China's resource ambitions remain high. Similarly, the United States, despite its domestic oil reserves, has engaged in multiple conflicts in the Middle East, a region holding two-thirds of the world's global oil reserves. While official justifications vary, critics argue these engagements were partly driven by resource control, with estimates of Syrian oil fields potentially yielding billions over years. Beyond traditional energy, critical minerals are becoming a new front in resource conflicts. Modern technology and everyday life are heavily dependent on elements such as lithium, iron, titanium, uranium, manganese, and graphite. Ukraine, for example, is estimated to possess 5% of the world's rare earth mineral supply, the largest potential for lithium extraction in the region, Europe's largest uranium deposit, and the sixth largest iron ore extraction industry globally. These resources are so strategically vital that even a prior extraction deal between Washington and Ukraine was insufficient to prevent the conflict. China holds a dominant position in the rare minerals market, controlling 60% of global production and up to 80% of processing capacity, granting it significant leverage over international supply and pricing. This strategic control was demonstrated when China retaliated against trade tariffs by temporarily restricting mineral exports to the United States, forcing Washington to reconsider its stance. Ultimately, the indispensable nature of certain resources, particularly those vital for emerging technologies and advanced weaponry, almost inevitably guarantees future conflicts. As nations scramble to secure these materials, the likelihood of resource-driven wars escalates. Resources, however, are not the sole architects of war. Throughout history, some of the deadliest battles have been fought over abstract ideas and deeply held beliefs. Religious wars ravaged Europe for centuries, from the Crusades to the 30 Years' War, which decimated a third of Central Europe's population. The Protestant Reformation fractured nations and ignited conflicts that persisted for generations. Today, sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia Muslims continues to destabilize the Middle East, while Hindu-Muslim tensions frequently erupt into violence across South Asia. Even in ostensibly secular nations, religious and cultural differences can intertwine with issues like immigration and social integration, contributing to social friction. Nationalism, the fervent belief that each ethnic group deserves its own sovereign state, has proven equally destructive. The collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s starkly demonstrated how quickly neighboring communities can descend into brutal ethnic warfare. In regions like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, ethnic and national groups remain locked in persistent struggles over territory and identity. The global ideological struggle between democracy and authoritarianism also continues to manifest through proxy conflicts worldwide. Research suggests that once a country firmly establishes either system, it tends to become more stable internally. However, conflict often ignites when these two fundamentally opposing systems confront each other across shared borders. This dynamic largely explains why the Cold War, despite its intensity, never escalated into direct armed conflict between major global powers, instead playing out through proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, and other geopolitical frontiers where their spheres of influence converged. A significant driver of large-scale conflicts is the security dilemma. When one nation strengthens its military to enhance its own security, its neighbors often perceive this as a potential threat, prompting them to expand their own armed forces in response. This escalating cycle leads to an arms race, where all participants expend greater resources on defense, paradoxically ending up feeling less secure. The security dilemma elucidates why nuclear weapons, initially conceived to make large-scale war unthinkable, have instead fueled further conflict and instability through proliferation. What began with 2 nuclear powers has expanded to 9, with more nations aspiring to join this exclusive club. Each new nuclear state heightens the risk of these devastating weapons falling into the wrong hands or being deployed in regional crises that spiral catastrophically out of control. Some nations, such as China, are dramatically increasing their nuclear arsenals, planning to double them between 2020 and 2030. China's broader military buildup exemplifies the security dilemma in action. As Beijing expands its naval and missile capabilities, major global powers respond by bolstering their presence in the Pacific and strengthening alliances with regional partners, which China, in turn, interprets as hostile, further intensifying its own military modernization. Neither side explicitly desires war, yet their respective preparations make it increasingly probable. Furthermore, observations of test sites depicting mock vessels targeted by anti-ship missiles deep within Chinese territory indicate a concerted effort to counter existing military capabilities. Modern technology has rendered the security dilemma even more perilous. Cyber attacks can cripple a nation's infrastructure in minutes, creating pressure for preemptive digital strikes. Undersea cables, carrying the bulk of global internet and data traffic, offer strategic leverage to submarines and sea drones. Artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons systems promise to make future wars faster, more complex, and less predictable. This is already evident in regions of ongoing conflict, which have rapidly become significant drone producers despite economic limitations. Space itself has emerged as the newest battlefield, with nations racing to develop anti-satellite weapons capable of blinding enemy forces. Even setting aside culture, nationality, or technology, some conflicts are profoundly shaped by demographics. Countries with large proportions of young adults, typically defined as ages 15 to 29, are significantly more prone to civil unrest and international conflicts. Research consistently indicates that nations with substantial youth bulges are the most susceptible to instability. Conversely, states with older populations tend to be more peaceful. The statistics are compelling. Among 67 countries identified with major youth bulges, 60 are grappling with serious unrest or violence. Young populations introduce unique pressures that older societies often do not face. When a large cohort of young people simultaneously enters the job market, they frequently encounter a scarcity of employment opportunities. This trend is exacerbated by older adults remaining healthier and more productive, leading to later retirements, alongside wages that have not kept pace with the rising cost of living, compelling many to work well into their later years. Rapid urbanization compounds this problem, as young workers migrate from rural areas to cities that lack sufficient jobs or affordable housing. This combination fosters growing inequality, simmering resentment, and a higher propensity for street violence to escalate into broader political conflict, eventually potentially spilling across national borders. The youth bulge follows a predictable pattern. As nations industrialize, death rates typically decline first, while birth rates remain high, leading to rapidly expanding young populations for which existing systems are ill-equipped to provide. History offers numerous examples of the subsequent revolutions and widespread unrest, from 17th century England to 18th century France and the Balkans preceding the World Wars. Delving deeper into the youth bulge phenomenon reveals another critical trigger: inequality. This is not merely the disparity between rich and poor, but crucially, horizontal inequality, where entire groups defined by culture, ethnicity, or religion experience collective deprivation. When these group-based inequalities are pronounced, they create fertile ground for organized crime and violence, which can rapidly destabilize the political landscape. Despite the immense suffering and destruction wars inflict, they have, for some, also been undeniably profitable. Today, the military-industrial complex represents a vast, intricate network connecting defense contractors, political leadership, and military institutions. This complex fosters a system of mutual reliance that inherently biases towards increased military spending and, at times, direct military intervention. The sheer scale of these interests is staggering. Global military expenditure reached $2.7 trillion in 2024, the highest share of the world economy since the Cold War. One prominent nation leads this spending by a considerable margin, outspending almost every other major power combined. Arms sales mirror this trend, with hundreds of billions in exports annually, and a significant portion of the global defense market controlled by its corporations. This military-industrial complex operates as a self-sustaining engine, generating consistent revenue for some of the world's largest companies. In turn, these corporations exert substantial influence over national policies, thereby securing even greater leverage in a perpetual feedback loop. This intertwining of economic and political power is evident in campaign contributions. Members of legislative committees overseeing armed services who support increased defense spending, on average, receive substantially more funding from defense companies than those who vote against such increases. This pattern is not unique to any single nation. Other countries are following similar trajectories, driven by the same logic. More weapons mean a more robust defense industry, which translates to greater profits, and these profits flow directly into politics, rendering the system exceedingly difficult to dismantle. These complexes profit most when conflicts actually occur, as the utility and demand for weapons are maximized during wartime. This creates a profound paradox. Over time, war itself can become profitable. The post-World War II economic boom clearly illustrates this. The GDP of a major global power surged from hundreds of billions in 1945 to trillions by 1975, with wartime production laying the groundwork for decades of growth. Even nations utterly devastated by the war, such as Japan and parts of Europe, experienced remarkable economic recoveries in the years that followed. Research suggests that longer, more severe wars can actually boost post-war growth. A 10% increase in war duration has been linked to a 2.1% increase in average growth afterward. The underlying reasons are manifold. War accelerates innovation, fundamentally reshapes industries, and forces significant social changes, shifts that continue to fuel economic activity long after the cessation of hostilities. However, war always exacts a colossal price. A recent conflict, for example, cost hundreds of billions by a specific year, funds that could have been allocated to education, healthcare, or critical infrastructure. While war might catalyze growth for some, it can also exacerbate global inequality, potentially plunging societies back into the very struggles over resources and power that ignited the conflict in the first place. A relatively newer, yet increasingly potent, catalyst for conflict is climate change. Its roots trace back to the Industrial Revolution, when burgeoning cities, soaring productivity, and an insatiable demand for new resources, from rare earth metals to coal and oil, became central to societal development. For 2 centuries, industrial expansion reshaped the planet with little regard for environmental consequences. Now, these profound changes are returning to haunt us. Water scarcity already affects billions worldwide, and climate change is projected to intensify droughts, alter rainfall patterns, and further exacerbate this critical shortage. The dispute over a major dam on the Nile River, for example, vividly illustrates how critical water infrastructure can rapidly escalate into an international flashpoint. Some resource struggles are not merely natural occurrences but are entirely man-made, stemming from pollution and over-extraction. Climate migration looms as a potential ultimate driver of future conflict. Estimates suggest that up to 1 billion people could be displaced by 2050, triggering refugee flows on an unprecedented scale. Such mass movements would profoundly reshape the cultural and religious demographics of even the most stable nations. Historically, countries have often been reluctant to absorb millions of outsiders, fearing the permanence of such displacements. The stark difference with climate-induced migration is that these dislocations may indeed become permanent, leading to enduring instability and potential conflict. Beneath all these strategic, economic, and political factors lies an even deeper, more fundamental element: human nature itself. In humanity's ancestral past, fierce loyalty to one's own group and aggressive defense against outsiders were often essential for survival. However, in an interconnected world armed with nuclear weapons, these primal instincts now carry the potential for catastrophic consequences. Political leaders frequently understand and skillfully exploit these inherent tendencies. Authoritarian rulers throughout history have risen to power by effectively identifying external enemies and promising to staunchly defend the nation against them. Even within democracies, rallying populations against perceived foreign threats can serve to unite fractured societies and divert attention from pressing domestic problems. The psychology of war also profoundly influences individual choices. Soldiers fight not solely for abstract political objectives, but often for the comrades beside them. Populations coalesce behind wars when they genuinely believe their group is under attack, and when it comes to conflict, emotions frequently override rational considerations, even if the perceived threat is objectively minor. The uncomfortable truth that war persists is partly because, in some instances, it works. Nations that employ force can indeed gain land, secure vital resources, or achieve perceived security objectives. And when these core interests are threatened, war often becomes the default, tragic resort. The world may indeed remain perpetually at war, a poignant reflection of its complex challenges. In conclusion, the pervasive nature of war throughout human history is not attributable to a single cause, but rather to a complex interplay of factors. From the relentless competition for dwindling resources and deeply ingrained ideological divisions, to the perilous dynamics of the security dilemma, demographic pressures, the economic incentives of military-industrial complexes, and the emerging challenges of climate change, humanity is perpetually drawn into conflict. These external drivers are further compounded by fundamental aspects of human nature, our tribal instincts, fears, and vulnerabilities, which are often exploited by those in power. While the instruments and scale of warfare have evolved, the underlying reasons for its persistence remain disturbingly consistent, trapping us in a cycle that has consistently made peace the exception, not the rule. The challenge for humanity, therefore, is to transcend these ancient patterns and find new pathways towards a future where collaboration truly outweighs conflict.